The day a billionaire noticed me was the same day I lost everything. The rain had started sometime after lunch, a steady gray curtain that turned the sidewalks of Cedar Grove into rivers of reflected streetlights and blurred headlights. By 5 o'clock, my uniform was soaked through, my sneakers squished with every step, and the cardboard box in my arms was beginning to fall apart. Inside were the only things I had left from the job I'd just lost. A framed photo of my mother. A chipped coffee mug. 2 paperback novels with bent corners. 4 years of loyalty reduced to a box that cost less than a fast food meal. I tightened my grip and kept walking. There wasn't much else to do. The mansion behind me sat on top of a hill overlooking the neighborhood, glowing warm and golden against the storm. It looked beautiful from the outside. Most expensive things did. Earlier that afternoon, Mrs. Kensington had stood in her marble kitchen and told me my services were no longer needed. No warning. No explanation that made sense. Just a cold smile and a check folded neatly inside an envelope. "We're making changes," she had said. 4 years. 4 birthdays missed. 4 Christmas mornings spent polishing silver instead of opening gifts. 4 years helping raise children who hugged me goodbye while their mother stared at her phone. And in less than 5 minutes, it was over. I should have been angry. Maybe part of me was. But mostly I was tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones and makes every dream feel heavier than it should. A sudden gust of wind nearly ripped the box from my hands. One corner collapsed. My book slipped onto the wet pavement. "Great," I whispered. I crouched immediately, trying to save them before the rain ruined the pages. That was when I noticed the little boy. He couldn't have been older than 8. He stood beside a bicycle with a twisted chain, staring at it with watery eyes. His yellow raincoat hung nearly to his ankles. "Need help?" I asked before I could stop myself. The boy looked up. "I can't get home." I glanced down the street. My bus stop was only another block away. The next bus came in 12 minutes. If I missed it, I'd wait another hour. My landlord had already left 2 voicemails asking about rent. My stomach was empty. My future suddenly looked uncertain. And yet I found myself setting the box down anyway. "Let me see." I knelt in the rain beside the bicycle. My fingers were cold. The chain was covered in grease. It took almost 10 minutes to fix. By the time I stood, my hands were black and my knees ached. But the boy's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He pedaled away smiling. I watched him disappear around the corner. Then I picked up my soggy box and continued walking. What I didn't know was that someone had been watching the entire time. Across the street stood the largest property in Cedar Grove. Iron gates. Stone walls. Windows stretching 2 stories high. Most people only knew it as Blackwood Manor. Home of Ethan Blackwood. Billionaire. Investor. One of the richest men in America. At that exact moment, Ethan stood beside a floor-to-ceiling window holding a cup of untouched coffee. He had spent the last hour reviewing contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet somehow he found himself staring through the rain at a housemaid carrying a collapsing cardboard box. And when he saw her stop to help a stranded child instead of helping herself, he lowered the coffee cup slowly and asked a question he couldn't explain. "Who is she?" I missed the bus by 30 seconds. I watched its taillights disappear through the rain while cold water dripped from the end of my nose and onto the cardboard box balanced against my hip. For a moment, I considered laughing. It felt like the kind of day that deserved laughter or tears, and I was too exhausted for either. The next bus would not arrive for almost an hour. So I started walking. My apartment sat nearly 3 miles away on the other side of town. Normally I would never choose to walk that far in a storm, but normal had stopped existing sometime around noon when I lost my job. The rain softened as evening settled over Cedar Grove. Storefront lights glowed along Main Street. Families hurried home carrying takeout bags. Couples shared umbrellas. Everyone seemed to belong somewhere. I lowered my eyes and kept moving. By the time I reached my apartment building, the sky had turned dark blue. The brick structure looked older than ever. Paint peeled from the railings. One hallway light flickered near the entrance. Home. At least for now. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and unlocked the door. The familiar scent of laundry detergent and chamomile tea greeted me immediately. My mother sat in her recliner beside the window, wrapped in her favorite blanket. Her silver hair reflected the soft lamplight. She smiled the moment she saw me. "Long day?" she asked. I forced a smile of my own. "You could say that." I did not tell her about losing the job. Not yet. She already worried too much. Instead, I helped her prepare dinner, heated a can of soup, and listened as she told me about the crossword puzzle she had finally finished after 3 days. The simple conversation eased something inside me. Maybe not everything was falling apart. Maybe only part of it was. Later that night, after she had gone to bed, I sat at the tiny kitchen table with a notebook and a calculator. Rent. Utilities. Medication. Groceries. I stared at the numbers until they blurred together. No matter how many times I added them, the answer remained the same. I needed work. Fast. Around 11 o'clock, I finally closed the notebook and walked toward the window. Rain still tapped softly against the glass. Across town, beyond rows of rooftops and quiet streets, lights still burned inside Blackwood Manor. Ethan Blackwood sat alone in his study. A leather folder rested open on his desk. Inside was a report his assistant had prepared less than an hour earlier. Grace Parker. 27 years old. Housemaid. No criminal record. No debt beyond a small student loan. Primary caregiver for her mother. Ethan read the file twice. Then a third time. He was not entirely sure why. He had spent years reviewing companies, acquisitions, and investments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet somehow this single file held his attention longer than any business proposal had all week. Finally, he looked toward the rain-covered window and frowned slightly. One question lingered in his mind. If Grace Parker had just been fired, why had she spent 10 minutes helping a stranded child when she clearly needed help herself? And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Blackwood found himself wanting to know the answer. The next morning began at 6:15 with the sound of my alarm and the smell of coffee that was probably too weak to qualify as coffee. I dressed quietly so I would not wake my mother, slipped on my worn sneakers, and stepped out into the cool morning air with a folder full of resumes tucked beneath my arm. Cedar Grove looked different at sunrise. Cleaner somehow. Hopeful. The bakery on Main Street had just opened. Delivery trucks rolled through empty intersections. Store owners unlocked doors and prepared for another day. I spent the next 6 hours walking from one business to another. A diner needed someone with weekend availability I could not promise. A grocery store manager accepted my application without looking up from his phone. A hotel receptionist gave me a polite smile that felt suspiciously like rejection. By noon, my feet hurt and my optimism had started to fade. I sat on a bench outside a small park and counted the cash left in my wallet. $43. I stared at the number for a long moment. Then I folded the bills carefully and put them away. Self-pity had never paid a single bill. Across town, Ethan Blackwood was supposed to be attending a board meeting. Instead, he found himself standing beside another floor-to-ceiling window. His assistant, Daniel, stood nearby holding a tablet. "The investors are waiting," Daniel reminded him. Ethan barely nodded. His attention remained fixed on the street below. "You said she was looking for work?" Daniel blinked. "Grace Parker?" "Yes." Ethan frowned slightly. "How many places has she visited today?" Daniel looked down at the tablet. 8 so far. Something about that answer bothered him more than it should have. 8 businesses. 8 chances to stop worrying about rent. 8 chances to make her life easier. Yet she was still walking. Still trying. Still refusing to quit. Ethan finally turned away from the window. Reschedule the meeting for this afternoon. Daniel looked surprised. Sir? This morning is no longer available. Daniel had worked for Ethan for almost 7 years. He had seen billion-dollar negotiations, corporate takeovers, international expansion plans. Yet somehow a former housemaid was the first thing that had successfully disrupted Ethan Blackwood's schedule. Back in town, I stopped at a neighborhood cafe hoping to buy the cheapest lunch available. The bell above the door chimed softly as I entered. Warm air wrapped around me immediately. Fresh bread. Cinnamon. Coffee. The scent alone made my stomach growl. I ordered a small cup of soup and found a seat by the window. For the first time all day, I allowed myself to rest. Outside, people hurried along the sidewalk. Cars rolled past. Life continued as if nothing had changed. Maybe that was the hardest part. The world never paused when your own life fell apart. I lifted the spoon toward my mouth when movement outside caught my attention. A black luxury sedan had stopped across the street. Expensive. Immaculate. Out of place in this part of town. The driver remained inside. The windows were tinted too dark to see through. I frowned briefly before returning to my lunch. What I did not know was that behind those windows, Ethan Blackwood was watching the woman who had somehow become the most interesting part of his week. The sedan was gone by the time I stepped back onto the sidewalk. I forgot about it almost immediately. People with cars like that did not belong in my world. They belonged to magazine covers, private airports, and neighborhoods where the lawns looked professionally painted. I belonged to bus schedules and discount grocery stores. The two worlds rarely crossed. The next morning, I woke before sunrise and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. My mother was still asleep. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I spent 3 hours searching job listings and sending applications. Housekeeping. Reception work. Administrative assistant positions. Anything that paid enough to keep the lights on. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. My heart jumped. Unknown number. I answered immediately. The interview lasted less than 3 minutes. They had already filled the position. By noon, I had received 4 more rejections. Each one polite. Each one discouraging. I finally closed the laptop and rubbed my eyes. One day at a time, I whispered. It was something my mother always said when life became difficult. One day at a time. Across town, Ethan sat through a meeting he barely heard. Charts flashed across a giant screen. Executives discussed projections and quarterly forecasts. Numbers filled the room. Usually he noticed every detail. Today he found himself distracted. Mr. Blackwood, someone asked. Ethan looked up. I am sorry. Repeat that. Several executives exchanged surprised glances. Ethan Blackwood never lost focus. Not once in 12 years. Yet somehow he had spent the last 10 minutes wondering whether Grace Parker had found a job. The thought irritated him. He did not understand it. When the meeting finally ended, he walked directly to his office. Daniel followed. Anything else this afternoon? Ethan asked. Daniel hesitated. Actually, yes. He placed a folder on the desk. You asked me to continue looking into Grace Parker. Ethan glanced at the folder. And? There is something unusual. Ethan opened it. Inside were employment records and background information. Nothing alarming. Nothing dramatic. Then he reached the final page. His eyes narrowed. She volunteers? Daniel nodded. Twice a week. Community center on Oak Street. Ethan looked up. Even now? Yes. Daniel checked his tablet. She was there yesterday afternoon. 3 hours. Ethan stared at the page silently. She had lost her job. She was struggling financially. Yet she was still giving away time she could have spent helping herself. It made no sense. Or perhaps it made too much sense. Late that afternoon, I arrived at the community center carrying 2 bags of donated books. The building was old but cheerful. Bright murals covered the walls. Children laughed somewhere down the hallway. The sound immediately lifted my mood. Mrs. Henderson greeted me near the front desk. "Grace, thank goodness. The reading program starts in 20 minutes. I smiled. "I brought extra books. You are a lifesaver." For the next 2 hours, I forgot about rent, job applications, and unpaid bills. I sat on a colorful rug reading stories to a dozen children who listened as if every word mattered. Maybe that was why I kept coming back. For a little while, everyone felt hopeful. Including me. What I did not know was that a black sedan had quietly parked across the street once again. And behind the tinted glass, Ethan Blackwood watched as the woman with almost nothing somehow continued giving pieces of herself away to everyone else. 2 days later, I received exactly 1 call back. I stared at my phone for 3 full seconds before answering. Hope could be dangerous when money was running low. The interview was for a housekeeping position at a small bed and breakfast on the edge of town. The owner sounded kind. The pay was not great, but it was something. I arrived 20 minutes early wearing the nicest clothes I owned. The building looked charming from the outside. White siding. Flower boxes beneath every window. A wooden sign swinging gently in the breeze. For the first time in days, I felt optimistic. The interview lasted less than 10 minutes. The manager smiled politely and thanked me for coming. Then she explained that someone else had already accepted the position that morning. I walked back to the parking lot with my stomach in knots. The disappointment should not have hurt. After all, I barely knew the place existed an hour earlier. But somehow it did. Every closed door felt heavier than the last one. I sat on a nearby bench and stared at the pavement. Around me, people moved through their lives without noticing mine slowly coming apart. My savings account was shrinking. My mother's medication refill was due next week. Rent was due in 11 days. For the first time, fear slipped past my optimism. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. Then another. One day at a time, I whispered again. When I finally stood, an elderly woman nearby struggled with 2 large grocery bags. One split open. Cans rolled across the sidewalk. Without thinking, I hurried over. "I have got them." She smiled gratefully. Together we gathered everything and carried the bags to her car. It took less than 5 minutes. By the time we finished, she looked relieved. "Thank you, sweetheart." "Of course. You seem like a very good person." I laughed softly. "I am just trying to make it through the week." The woman squeezed my hand before driving away. I watched her disappear and felt a little lighter. Helping people never solved my problems. But somehow it always reminded me who I wanted to be. Several miles away, Ethan sat inside his office reviewing another stack of reports. His attention drifted repeatedly toward the photograph lying beside his keyboard. It had been taken that afternoon by a private investigator. Grace carrying grocery bags for a stranger. Grace smiling despite obvious exhaustion. Grace helping someone when nobody was helping her. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Daniel looked up from across the room. "Sir?" Ethan tapped the photograph once. "I have spent more time thinking about this woman in a week than I have spent thinking about most people in years." Daniel wisely said nothing. Ethan stood and walked toward the window. Below him, the city stretched toward the horizon. Wealth. Success. Influence. He had built an empire from nothing. Yet lately, none of it felt particularly interesting. His phone buzzed. A message from an old friend inviting him to another charity gala. Normally he would decline immediately. This time he paused. The event was being held at the Oak Street Community Center. The same place Grace volunteered every week. For a long moment, Ethan stared at the invitation. Then he quietly replied with a single word. Attending. The charity gala took place the following Friday evening. I almost did not go. Technically, volunteers were invited to help set up tables, organize donations, and welcome guests. Normally I never missed community events. This time exhaustion nearly convinced me to stay home. But Mrs. Henderson had called personally. So at 6 o'clock, I found myself arranging centerpieces in the Oak Street Community Center ballroom while trying not to think about unpaid bills. The room looked beautiful. White tablecloths. Warm lights. Fresh flowers donated by a local florist. For a few hours, the old building felt transformed. Families arrived first. Then business owners. Then local officials. Everyone smiled and shook hands. Everyone seemed optimistic about the future. I wished some of that optimism would rub off on me. Grace, can you help at the welcome table? Mrs. Henderson asked. Of course. I moved toward the entrance and greeted guests as they arrived. The evening passed quickly. Then the room suddenly grew quieter. Not silent. Just different. The way a room changes when someone important enters. Curious, I glanced toward the front doors. My breath caught. Ethan Blackwood had just walked inside. I recognized him immediately from newspapers and television interviews. Tall. Confident. Impeccably dressed. The kind of man people noticed without being told to notice him. Several guests immediately approached him. Conversations shifted. Attention followed him across the room. I looked away almost instantly. Men like Ethan Blackwood belonged in a completely different universe. A few minutes later, I carried a tray of donation forms toward the stage. Distracted by the crowd, I accidentally bumped into someone. Paper slipped from my hands. I am so sorry, I said automatically as forms scattered across the floor. Before I could kneel, another person crouched beside me. Strong hands gathered the papers carefully. For one strange second, all I could see were polished black shoes and an expensive watch. Then I looked up. Ethan Blackwood. My heart nearly stopped. I think these belong to you, he said. His voice was calm. Warm. Nothing like the intimidating executive I had imagined. Thank you. I accepted the papers quickly. That was my fault. No, he replied with a faint smile. I was not paying attention either. For a moment neither of us moved. Then someone called his name from across the room. Ethan stood. Have a good evening, Grace. I froze. You know my name? The question escaped before I could stop it. Something flickered briefly in his expression. You volunteer here. People speak highly of you. Then he walked away. I stood there staring after him while confusion twisted through my mind. Across the ballroom, Ethan accepted greetings and handshakes. Yet his attention kept drifting back toward the woman standing beside the stage. The woman who looked tired. The woman who clearly carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. The woman who had no idea that for the first time in years, someone had managed to leave Ethan Blackwood thinking about something other than business. The gala ended just after 9:30. Volunteers folded tables, stacked chairs, and packed away decorations while guests drifted into the cool night air. I stayed behind to help clean. It felt easier than going home and staring at unpaid bills. By the time I finished, the parking lot was nearly empty. My feet ached. My shoulders felt heavy. But for the first time in days, my mind kept returning to something other than money. Ethan Blackwood knew my name. The thought should not have mattered. Yet somehow it did. I pushed it aside during the drive home. Men like him noticed thousands of people every year. I was simply another volunteer in another charity event. Nothing more. The next morning, reality returned quickly. I opened the mailbox outside our apartment and found 3 envelopes. 1 utility bill. 1 insurance notice. 1 reminder from the landlord. My stomach tightened before I even opened them. Back upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table and reviewed the numbers. They looked worse than before. Much worse. My mother noticed immediately. "Grace?" she asked softly. "Everything all right?" I forced a smile. "Of course." She looked unconvinced but let it go. I hated lying to her. I hated worrying her even more. Later that afternoon, I visited the pharmacy to refill one of her prescriptions. When the pharmacist gave me the total, my heart sank. The cost had increased again. I stared at the register for a moment longer than necessary before handing over my debit card. The machine processed the payment. Barely. As I stepped outside carrying the medication, a cold wind swept through the parking lot. Autumn was arriving early. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking. Across town, Ethan sat inside Blackwood Manor reviewing documents he could not concentrate on. The previous evening replayed repeatedly in his mind. Grace gathering papers from the floor. Grace looking surprised when he said her name. Grace thanking him with that small, sincere smile. Most people wanted something from him. Opportunities. Investments. Favors. Access. Grace had wanted nothing. The realization stayed with him all morning. Finally, he set the documents aside. Daniel. His assistant appeared almost immediately. "Sir?" Ethan looked toward the window. "Tell me something." "About what?" "Why does she keep volunteering?" Daniel blinked. "I am not sure. She needs money. She needs work. Yet she gives away hours every week." Daniel considered the question carefully. Maybe because helping people matters to her more than convenience. Ethan remained silent. Somehow that answer made perfect sense. That evening, I returned to the community center for another reading program. The children greeted me with excited smiles. One little girl ran over carrying a book almost as large as she was. "Can you read this one tonight?" she asked. "Absolutely." For the next hour, I forgot every problem waiting outside those walls. Laughter filled the room. Stories came alive. Hope felt possible again. Then Mrs. Henderson approached carrying a sealed envelope. "This arrived for the center today," she said. "It is addressed to you." Confused, I accepted it. There was no return address. No company logo. Nothing. Just my name written neatly across the front. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single card. And what I read next made my breath catch. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the card. The message inside was short. Elegant. Simple. The children at Oak Street Community Center deserve every opportunity to succeed. A donation has been made in honor of your dedication. Thank you for reminding people that kindness still matters. There was no signature. No company name. Nothing that explained who had sent it. I read the words twice. Then a third time. Mrs. Henderson was watching me carefully. "Is everything all right?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "I think so." She smiled. "Whoever sent that card also donated enough money to fund every reading program for the next 2 years." My eyes widened. 2 years? Every book. Every supply. Every event. I looked down at the card again. The handwriting seemed strangely familiar, although I could not explain why. For the rest of the evening, I could not stop thinking about it. Someone had changed the future of the community center. Someone had done it quietly. No speeches. No publicity. No cameras. Just help. The next morning, life returned to normal. At least that was what I told myself. I spent hours searching job listings. Sent more applications. Received more silence. Around noon, I walked to the grocery store with a carefully prepared shopping list. Every dollar mattered now. I compared prices. Chose generic brands. Calculated totals before reaching the register. Halfway through the cereal aisle, my phone rang. I almost ignored it. Then I saw the hospital number on the screen. Fear immediately tightened my chest. Hello? Miss Parker, this is Cedar Grove Medical Center. Do not worry. Your mother is fine. I exhaled so quickly I nearly became dizzy. Okay. Her doctor would like to schedule additional testing next week. My grip tightened around the shopping cart. Additional testing usually meant additional expenses. I understand. After the call ended, I stood motionless for several seconds. The fluorescent lights above seemed suddenly brighter. The store felt quieter. Life had a way of adding weight exactly when your arms were already full. Later that afternoon, Ethan sat inside his office reviewing a financial report he had no interest in reading. The anonymous donation had been completed 3 days earlier. He had expected satisfaction. Instead, he found himself wondering whether Grace had received the card. Whether she was smiling. Whether she had guessed who sent it. The answer, according to Daniel, was no. She has no idea, Daniel said. Ethan stared out the window. Oddly enough, that relieved him. He had not wanted gratitude. He had simply wanted to help. The realization surprised him more than anything else. His phone buzzed. Another business opportunity. Another investment proposal. Another chance to increase a fortune that already felt larger than necessary. Ethan silenced the notification and glanced toward a photograph resting on his desk. Grace surrounded by children at the community center. Smiling. Laughing. Looking genuinely happy. For a long moment, he studied the image. Then his expression shifted. Daniel. Yes, sir? Ethan looked away from the photograph. Find out why Cedar Grove Medical Center called Grace Parker today. Daniel blinked. Sir? Ethan's voice remained calm. Something is wrong. I can feel it. And for the first time since losing her job, Grace Parker was about to face a problem that could not be solved with determination alone. 3 days later, I sat beside my mother in a small examination room at Cedar Grove Medical Center. The walls were painted a cheerful shade of blue that failed completely at making hospitals feel less frightening. My mother smiled calmly while flipping through an old magazine. I pretended to do the same. Inside, I was terrified. When the doctor finally entered, his expression was kind but serious. He reviewed several charts before speaking. The good news is that we caught this early. I held my breath. The additional treatment should help significantly. However, it will require a specialized program. My stomach tightened. How much will it cost? The doctor hesitated. That was all the answer I needed. The number that followed felt impossible. By the time we returned home, the afternoon sun had disappeared behind thick gray clouds. My mother remained optimistic. I wished I had inherited that ability. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by bills, estimates, and paperwork that looked more like obstacles than solutions. I spent the evening making phone calls. Insurance providers. Assistance programs. Financial aid offices. Every conversation ended the same way. Long waiting periods. Limited availability. Uncertain outcomes. Near midnight, I finally closed my laptop and rested my forehead against my folded arms. For the first time in years, I felt completely lost. Across town, Ethan listened silently as Daniel finished his report. The additional treatment is expensive, Daniel explained. Far beyond what she can realistically manage right now. Ethan stared at the city lights outside his office window. And she is still looking for work? Every day. Daniel paused. There is something else. Ethan turned slightly. What? She applied for a position at Blackwood Hospitality this morning. Ethan blinked. One of ours? Yes. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Out of thousands of companies, Grace had unknowingly applied to one of his. Daniel handed him a file. Ethan opened it immediately. Housekeeping supervisor. Full benefits. Competitive salary. Stable hours. The position had remained vacant for nearly 2 months because nobody had impressed the hiring manager. Ethan reviewed the application. Then he saw something attached to the final page. A handwritten note. Not a plea. Not a request for sympathy. Simply a short paragraph explaining her work ethic and her commitment to supporting her family. Honest. Humble. Genuine. Ethan read it twice. Then a third time. Finally he closed the folder. Schedule an interview. Daniel raised an eyebrow. With her? Yes. Personally? Ethan considered the question. Personally. The next afternoon, my phone rang while I was carrying groceries into the apartment. I nearly dropped everything when I heard the message. Blackwood Hospitality wanted to meet with me. The interview was scheduled for Monday morning. I stood frozen in the kitchen long after the call ended. Hope returned so suddenly it almost hurt. For the first time in weeks, a door had opened instead of closing. What I did not know was that on the top floor of Blackwood Tower, Ethan Blackwood was already clearing his schedule for Monday morning. Monday arrived faster than I expected. I stood in front of the mirror at 6:30 in the morning adjusting the collar of my only interview blouse. The fabric was slightly worn. The sleeves had been repaired twice. But it was clean, pressed, and professional. That would have to be enough. My mother smiled from the kitchen table as she sipped tea. You are going to do great. I returned the smile. I hope so. The drive into downtown Cedar Grove felt longer than usual. Every red light seemed determined to test my patience. By the time Blackwood Tower appeared above the skyline, my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. The building was even more impressive up close. Glass. Steel. Perfect symmetry. The kind of place that made people stand a little straighter when they walked through the doors. Inside, everything gleamed. Polished floors reflected the morning light. Employees moved with purpose. I suddenly became very aware of how ordinary I looked. A receptionist greeted me warmly and directed me to the executive floor. Executive floor. The words alone nearly made me turn around. The elevator ride felt endless. When the doors finally opened, a woman in a navy suit welcomed me into a waiting area overlooking the city. Someone will be with you shortly. I nodded and sat down carefully. My hands felt cold despite the warmth of the room. Across the hall, Ethan Blackwood stood inside his office staring through a wall of glass at the city below. Daniel entered carrying a tablet. She is here. Ethan looked toward the conference room door. For reasons he could not fully explain, he felt more nervous than he had before billion-dollar negotiations. Thank you. Daniel studied him briefly. You know you could have delegated this interview. Ethan gave a faint smile. Apparently not. A few minutes later, the conference room door opened. I stepped inside and immediately stopped. Ethan Blackwood stood at the far end of the table. For one stunned second, neither of us spoke. I had expected a hiring manager. Human resources. Maybe a department supervisor. Not him. Definitely not him. Miss Parker. His voice was calm. Familiar. Thank you for coming. I managed a nod. Thank you for inviting me. We sat across from each other. The city stretched behind him through massive windows. Yet somehow the view became the least intimidating thing in the room. The interview began simply enough. Questions about experience, scheduling, leadership, problem solving. As the conversation continued, something unexpected happened. My nerves slowly faded. Ethan listened carefully. Really listened. He never interrupted. Never checked his phone. Never looked distracted. It felt less like an interview and more like a conversation. Finally, he picked up my application. You have excellent references. I worked hard for them. A small smile touched his face. I believe that. The room fell quiet for a moment. Then Ethan asked a question that was not listed on any application. Why do you keep helping people when your own life is so difficult right now? I blinked. The question caught me completely off guard. I looked down briefly before answering honestly. Because difficult things happen whether we help each other or not. I would rather make someone else's day a little easier if I can. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Ethan's gaze never left mine. And for the first time since entering the building, I had the strange feeling that this interview was about far more than a job. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city stretched beyond the glass walls, but it felt very far away. Ethan remained silent, waiting for my answer as though it genuinely mattered. That surprised me more than anything. Most people asked questions because they expected a certain response. He seemed interested in the truth. I folded my hands together. When my father passed away, people helped my family, I said quietly. Neighbors brought meals. Friends helped with bills. Complete strangers showed kindness when they had no reason to. I never forgot that. Ethan listened carefully. And now you are returning the favor. Something like that. A faint smile touched his face. Most people would focus on themselves if they were facing what you are facing. I laughed softly. Trust me. I think about myself plenty. The smile remained. Somehow it made him seem less intimidating. Less like a billionaire and more like a person. The realization caught me off guard. For the next 20 minutes, the conversation drifted beyond resumes and qualifications. We talked about leadership, responsibility, community programs, books, childhood memories. At some point, I forgot I was sitting across from one of the wealthiest men in the country. I only noticed that he asked thoughtful questions and paid attention to the answers. Eventually, the meeting came to an end. Ethan closed the folder and stood. I followed a second later. Thank you for your time, Miss Parker. Thank you for the opportunity. We shook hands. His grip was firm but gentle. Professional. Respectful. Yet something lingered in the moment. Something neither of us acknowledged. Then the elevator doors closed behind me and the interview was over. Or at least I thought it was. Back upstairs, Ethan remained standing in the conference room long after I left. Daniel entered a few moments later. Well, he asked. Ethan looked toward the elevator display. Hire her. Daniel smiled slightly. I thought you might say that. Full benefits. Of course. Ethan hesitated. And make sure her starting salary reflects the additional responsibilities. Daniel studied him for a moment. You are helping her. Ethan turned toward the window. She earned the job. The answer sounded convincing. Even to him. 2 days later, I received the call while organizing books at the community center. Mrs. Henderson nearly dropped a stack of folders when I gasped. Grace? She asked. I covered the phone and stared at her. I got it. Her eyes widened immediately. You got the job? I nodded. Suddenly she was hugging me. I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. Relief washed through me so quickly it almost hurt. A steady paycheck. Health insurance. Stability. Hope. That evening, I drove home with the windows down despite the cool autumn air. The sky glowed orange above Cedar Grove. For the first time in months, the future felt possible again. Across town, Ethan sat alone on the terrace outside Blackwood Manor. The sun disappeared slowly beyond the trees. His phone buzzed with messages he ignored. Business could wait. For some reason, he found himself wondering whether Grace had received the news yet. Then he looked down and noticed something unusual. He was smiling. And he could not remember the last time that had happened. My first week at Blackwood Hospitality passed in a blur of training sessions, schedules, introductions, and responsibilities. Every morning I arrived early. Every evening I left tired but grateful. The paycheck had not arrived yet, but for the first time in months I could see a path forward. My mother noticed the difference immediately. I smiled more. Slept better. Worried less. Even the apartment felt brighter somehow. One Thursday afternoon, I was reviewing inventory reports when my supervisor approached my desk. "Grace, there is a community partnership meeting at Blackwood Manor tomorrow evening. We need someone from our department to attend." I looked up. "Me? You have experience with local charities. You would be perfect." The words sounded simple enough until I heard the location. Blackwood Manor. Ethan's home. The following evening, I drove through iron gates and followed a winding road lined with maple trees glowing red and gold beneath the setting sun. The estate was breathtaking. Stone walls. Elegant gardens. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the evening sky. Everything felt impossibly distant from the world I knew. Inside, however, the atmosphere surprised me. The gathering was not glamorous. There were no reporters. No photographers. No grand speeches. Instead, community leaders sat around a long table discussing scholarships, literacy programs, and local outreach projects. Ethan sat at the head of the table listening carefully to every person who spoke. When he noticed me enter, something softened in his expression. "Miss Parker." I smiled. "Good evening. Thank you for coming." Throughout the meeting, I found myself watching him more than once. Not because he was wealthy. Not because he was powerful. Because he genuinely cared. He asked thoughtful questions. Remembered details about programs and families. Quietly approved funding requests without seeking recognition. The man I saw that evening was very different from the billionaire described in business magazines. After the meeting ended, guests slowly began leaving. I gathered my notes and headed toward the entrance. "Grace." I turned. Ethan stood a few feet away. "Would you like to see something?" Curiosity overcame hesitation. "Sure." He led me through a quiet hallway toward a smaller room overlooking the gardens. Shelves lined every wall. Hundreds of books filled the space. Children's books. History books. Novels. Educational materials. I stared in surprise. "This is beautiful." Ethan looked around the room. "It used to belong to my mother." His voice softened. "She believed education could change lives." I smiled. I think she was right. Silence settled comfortably between us. Not awkward. Not forced. Peaceful. Then Ethan looked at me with an honesty I had never seen before. "You know something strange?" he asked. "What?" His gaze held mine. "Before I met you, I spent most of my life building things. Companies. Investments. Success. I thought that was enough." I did not know what to say. Ethan smiled faintly. "Then you reminded me there are other things worth building too." And standing there surrounded by books and fading sunlight, I realized this conversation was changing both of us in ways neither of us fully understood yet. Winter arrived quietly that year. The trees outside our apartment shed their final leaves. Holiday lights appeared across Cedar Grove. Life moved forward one day at a time, and somehow, so did we. My new job became more than a paycheck. It became a purpose. The treatment program for my mother had begun successfully. The constant fear that had followed me for months slowly faded into something gentler. Hope. Real hope. One snowy afternoon, nearly a year after I lost my job at the Kensington estate, I stood inside the Oak Street Community Center watching workers install the final bookshelf in a brand new learning wing. Children ran between tables carrying stacks of books. Volunteers laughed while hanging decorations. The room buzzed with excitement. A small plaque near the entrance read, "Parker Learning Center." Every time I saw it, I felt overwhelmed. The project had started as a dream. A larger reading program. More resources. More opportunities for families who needed them. Somehow it had grown into something much bigger. "They are almost ready," Mrs. Henderson said beside me. I smiled. "It still does not feel real." "That is because you spent so much time making it happen." I looked around the room. A year earlier, I had been terrified of losing everything. Now children would have access to books, tutoring, and educational programs for years to come. Sometimes life changed slowly. Sometimes it changed all at once. Behind me, the entrance doors opened. I did not need to turn around to know who had arrived. Ethan had become part of my life gradually. Not through grand gestures. Not through dramatic declarations. Through consistency. Through kindness. Through showing up. He walked beside me and looked around the room. "You did it." I shook my head. "We did it." A warm smile crossed his face. "Fair enough." The crowd gathered near the front of the room as the opening ceremony began. Speeches were made. Donations were acknowledged. Volunteers received recognition. Yet when the applause finally ended and people began exploring the new space, Ethan and I quietly stepped away toward the windows overlooking the snowy courtyard. Outside, soft flakes drifted beneath the afternoon sky. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the children laughing together. Then Ethan broke the silence. "Do you remember the day you fixed that bicycle?" I laughed softly. "You were watching." "I was." "That is slightly unsettling." "Probably." His eyes reflected amusement. Then his expression softened. "I have spent a long time building businesses." I recognized the sentence immediately. A version of it had begun our conversation in the library months earlier. Ethan looked toward the children. "But this matters more." I followed his gaze. "Because it helps people. Because it gives people a chance." Silence settled between us once more. Comfortable. Familiar. Home. Looking back, it would have been easy to say a billionaire changed my life. In some ways, he did. But the truth was more complicated than that. Ethan helped me find stability when I needed it most. Yet he also found something through me. A reason to look beyond success. Beyond numbers. Beyond wealth. We changed each other. And maybe that was the point all along. The snow continued falling outside the window while laughter filled the room behind us. Ethan stood beside me. The children turned pages. The future stretched ahead. And for the first time in a very long time, everything felt exactly where it belonged. Because sometimes the most valuable thing a person can give another is not money. It is a reason to believe that tomorrow can be better than today.